Chapter 3. It was getting late in the afternoon, and the animals were beginning to emerge from their lairs. Yet I barely noticed them. Between the external world and my awareness of it stood King, Patricia's friend King, the great lion of the Kilimanjaro. Behind every bush, in each fold of open country, I seemed to see his mane and his golden eyes, the yawning cavern of his open jaws, the vast paws that played with a little girl as though she were a ball. When I got back to the car and Bogo began talking about herds on the move and migrating tribesmen, the same obsession ensured that I scarcely listened to a word he said. In fact, I didn't realize what he was driving at till the column of marching Maasai debouched on the main road. They, at last, brought me back to my actual surroundings. I had often before, in the course of my life, met with trekking nomads in many different countries, but even the poorest and most vagrant had always possessed some sort of baggage, threadbare and primitive though it might be, which was carried by pack animals, at the very worst by a few starving donkeys. These Maasai, on the other hand, traveled without so much as a single bag or package, without even a tent to shelter them at night, or a cooking pot in which to prepare their food. They carried no burdens or impedimenta of any kind whatsoever. The convoy moved in hollow square, with the herd at its center. The latter was composed of about 100 lean, scraggy cows, whose ribs and backbones stood out with skeletal clarity. Their slack, lackluster skin was covered with cuts and scratches. Swarms of flies gorged themselves on the oozing blood, but the tribe, or to be more precise, the tribal clan, whose sole possessions these wretched cattle were, showed none of the usual signs of extreme poverty. They were neither terrified, nor stupid, nor miserable, nor servile. The women in their tattered cotton wraps, the men with that fold of cloth slung over the shoulder on which they carried their spears, all alike marched along with a firm, swinging step, holding themselves erect, their bearing proud and independent. Loud shouts and bursts of laughter rippled up and down the column. No one in the world was richer than these folk, who owned nothing and had no desire to do so. This file of Maasai took up the entire width of the road. It would have been perfectly easy for them to close up their ranks and let our car pass, but the idea never even occurred to them. Bogo had to drive off the road himself and go bumping through the undergrowth before we finally overtook them. At the head of the column marched the young warriors of the clan, 3 moraines, with their strange top knots of dressed hair and red clay, the first of the 3, who was also the tallest, the handsomest, and the most insolent was Orunga. I leaned out the window and called out, "Kwaheri," the Maasai greeting to him. The children and some of the women who marched along behind the moraine returned this formal salutation very cheerfully, but Orunga himself did not so much as turn his head. I remained in my bungalow alone till nightfall. I completely unpacked all my luggage and set the contents in some sort of order. I put my books on the bookshelves and my provisions in the kitchen. I no longer knew how long my stay in the national park was liable to last. It entirely depended on King. Could I afford to haggle over a few more days, if they might prove like the one I had just spent? When it was time to go over to the Bullets' bungalow for dinner, I felt a little apprehensive. I was afraid that I might find a similar atmosphere to that of the previous night. Elaborate pretense, forced gaiety, with a screaming nervous tension underlying them. But the minute I got inside, I realized that my fear had been quite unjustified. Sybil, it was true, had put on evening dress. Bullet had plastered down his red hair with water. Patricia was wearing her sky blue dress and patent leather shoes, and the dining room was lit by candles. But all these things, which 24 hours ago had produced an unhappy, artificial atmosphere, tonight, through what agency I could not tell, gave the party an intimate, sophisticated charm. Sybil was careful not to make any reference to her uncontrollable outburst of the previous evening. To judge by appearances, it would seem that this crisis had been completely forgotten by her. It also appeared that so far as Sybil was concerned, the conventional rules of social etiquette were only necessary for a first visit, and that thereafter people could revert to their normal behavior and conversational tone. Thus I at once got the impression that she was treating me as a friend. Bullet thanked me with unaffected delight for bringing him a bottle of whiskey. "I was just running out, old boy," he murmured in my ear. "Between you and me, I sometimes think I punished the stuff a bit too hard." As for this polite demur, Patricia, she had nothing at all in common with the wild-haired Manad, whom I had seen stand beneath a spreading, shady tree and work her will on the great lion of Kilimanjaro. I forbade myself to think about King. I was afraid that in my hypnotized obsession with him, I might suddenly speak his name aloud. I had only too clear a recollection of the effect he had produced on Sybil, but we had hardly sat down to dinner when she brought the subject up herself. Smiling, she said, "I hear that Patricia showed you round our reserve today and introduced you to her best friend." This change of front was so complete that in my astonishment I decided she couldn't be referring to the lion at all. "Ah, yes," I said, "you mean," and I carefully let the question trail away uncompleted. "Why, King, of course," said Sybil cheerfully. "I hope you found him a beautiful, intelligent, and altogether magnificent beast," she added. And I saw that in a very light and affectionate way she was pulling Patricia's leg. I said, "I have never seen anything more astonishing in my life than the power your daughter has over this wild creature." Sybil's eyes remained as tranquil as before. "Patricia came home early today. We had time to go on with this morning's lessons." "I promise you, Mummy," Patricia said, "I promise you I'll be as clever as you one day, and I'll dress as well as your friend Lise." Sybil shook her head gently. "It won't be as simple as that, darling," she said. Patricia half closed her eyes. It was impossible to make out their expression behind the long, drooping lashes. "I haven't seen those school photographs of you and Lise for a long time now," she said. "Would you care to show them to us after dinner?" "There's a good girl, Pat," Bullet said. "Look how pleased Mummy is." Sybil's normally pale and faded cheeks were indeed faintly tinged with color. "I'd love to show you those old pictures," she told me. "I only hope you won't be too bored by them. Still, you'll have something to make up for it. John's got a whole collection of snaps of King when he was a cub." Sybil and her daughter said nothing to one another at this moment. They did not even exchange glances. Were they even aware that all day long they had pursued a secret, subtle, diplomatic agreement, and had finally negotiated an instinctive truce, a happy compromise for them both? When the meal was over, both Bullet and his wife went out in search of their photographic souvenirs. Sybil came back first, carrying a large flat album, gilt-edged, and bound in the most ghastly cloth boards imaginable. "I didn't choose it," she said. "It was a good conduct prize, awarded by our old headmistress." There was a wistful half-smile on her lips. She knew very well that her album was in the most appalling taste, but this very awfulness had its own value for her, since it recalled a period which she cherished dearly. Though I tried as hard as I could, I failed to summon up more than the barest expressions of polite appreciation as I went through these insipid photographs. The most they ever achieved was a kind of disarming silliness, but Patricia showed a most lively interest in them. Was this the result of deliberate pretense, or simple affection, or was it even possible that this distant world really stimulated her imagination and sensibilities? After all, the girls who moved in it were more or less of her own age. Whether it was in fact genuine or assumed, Patricia's sincerity seemed beyond all question. She gave little squeals of delight or admiration. She listened eagerly, and again encouraged Sybil to enlarge on some snapshot or other. She continually praised the appearance clothes, coiffure, and hair ribbons of one particular schoolgirl, who to me looked no different from any of the others, but was in fact Lise Darbois. This discussion was cut short by the return of Bullet, carrying a big strong envelope stuffed full of photographs. He put it down on a long, narrow side table and said, "Sorry to have been so long, but I honestly couldn't remember where I'd stacked this lot away. They're pretty old, you know." He slid out the first bundle of snaps and spread them side by side along the table. "First part of our serial, ladies and gentlemen," he announced. "King in the nursery." "Don't make a joke of it, John," Sybil said in a low voice. She stood bent over the photographs, examining them. Aloud she went on, "They haven't been taken out of their drawer for ages. I'd forgotten what an enchanting little creature he used to be. Look at these." She held out about a dozen snaps to me. Each showed the most sweet little animal imaginable. As she had said, and rather clumsy too, with its squarish head and scarce opened eyes. In all of them he was with a child who looked as though she might be Patricia's younger sister, sometimes curled up in her arms, sometimes clinging to her shoulder, and sometimes sucking away at the feeding bottle she held out to him. "Is that really King?" I exclaimed, despite myself. Bullet ran, one hand through his hair. It had had time to dry, and was now suddenly and noticeably ruffled, in every sense of the word. Embarrassed by an access of sentimentality, which made his hoarse voice huskier still, he said, "Even I find it hard to believe that pint-sized little creature could." Sybil broke in softly, "I've never in my life seen anything so defenseless and gentle and full of natural affection." Only Patricia said nothing, nor would she look at the photographs. "I would have adored to look after him in those days," Sybil went on, "but Patricia would never let me. If I so much as tried to lay a finger on that lying cub, she used to fly into the most frightful rages." Just for an instant, Patricia's face lost its placidity, and became suffused with the violent feeling I had observed during her circus act with King under the shady tree out in the bush. She said, "King belonged to me." Hastily, I held out a photograph to her and asked her to explain what was going on in it. All I could see was a shapeless woolly ball from which emerged two neat little ears and about half a small round muzzle. Both eyes were tight shut. "He'd caught a cold," Patricia said, "so I wrapped him up in my sweater." She sounded as though she might unbend a little, but just as I was on the point of asking her another question, she said curtly, "I'm afraid I was very small in those days. I've forgotten all about it." This was a lie, and I knew it. I knew it from what Patricia herself had told me as she happily sat between King's paws that afternoon. She remembered every least detail of the lion cub's development, but she had no wish to recall those last days when King depended entirely on her. Not now, when at this very moment the great beast was prowling freely through the African night, far beyond her reach. "If you want to find out more," she said, "you'd better ask my father. He took the photographs. He'll tell you anything you want to know." Then she turned back to the other album, with its awful lemon-colored binding, and Sybil went with her. The two of them settled down in the same armchair and began to talk in whispers. I could now give my undivided attention, and there was nothing I wanted to do more to the series of snaps which Bullet laid out, one after another, for my entertainment. He had sorted them into chronological order, with such meticulous accuracy indeed, that I followed every step in King's growth, as though on slow-motion film. I felt I was spying on some secret process of animal life as I watched King's extraordinary metamorphosis from a tiny cub nursed by a child into that splendid great creature, glorious in his strength and majesty, whose golden eyes still seemed to stare at me from under their royal mane. First he was a kitten, then a cat, then a recognizable cub, then a half-grown beast. Next he appeared as an unmistakable lion, but with his full size and power yet to come. Finally, there was King, just as I had seen him a few hours earlier. I turned the snaps over and examined the dates inscribed on each one. In Bullet's heavy square script, I said, "And that transformation took less than a year from start to finish." Bullet nodded. "More's the pity," he said. "These cubs grow much faster and bigger than we do, but that doesn't change the way they feel about people. Look at this next lot." The film continued to unwind, and what it showed us was progressively a greater and greater strain on my credulity. Here was this gigantic lion sitting beside Bullet in his Land Rover, or at table between him and Patricia. Here he was again, furiously tearing apart the kiboko with which he had just been punished, but not so much as growling at his master. Here he was playing with the rangers, and here licking Sybil's hand. Like an automaton, I repeated the word "incredible" as each new shot appeared. "What's so incredible about it?" Bullet remarked at length, in a mildly irritated voice. "When I was a kid, we found a lion cub abandoned in the bush, just like King. We took him home and kept him on the farm. For 5 whole years he stayed with us, and never harmed a living soul, white or black, never killed an animal either. When my father was transferred to a desk job in town, we had to turn that lion loose in the bush. Believe it or not, we had to teach him how to hunt and kill first." "What about this then?" I asked. The photograph I had in my hand showed King in a forest clearing, together with other lions. "Oh, that was taken when I was traveling round the reserve," Bullet said. "I just happened to run across him. He was having a high old time with a few of his chums. That used to happen quite often. But he always came back, Patricia said harshly. She was still in the big armchair with her mother. Bullet gathered up the photographs carelessly and stuffed them back into the envelope. Perhaps we ought to join the ladies again, he said. Sybil asked me endless questions about Paris and London. What were the latest books and plays? How had fashions changed? Who was giving the really big parties now? From time to time, she would sigh nostalgically. Then Patricia would snuggle up closer to her, and Sybil would caress her daughter's straight-cropped hair. Every time she made this gesture, it was duplicated by a vague, blurred shadow on the curtains. Bullet sat watching his wife and child, a black West Indian cigar stuck in one corner of his mouth. He seemed happy and relaxed. It must have been a very good cigar. Chapter 4. When I got back to my bungalow, the electric generator had already been turned off, but one of the native boys had lit a hurricane lamp for me and put it on the veranda table. I sat down and began to reflect on the events of the day. My nerves were on edge. The peaceful evening I had just spent had, oddly enough, strained them far more than the near hysterical outburst and scenes of the previous night. This all-pervasive atmosphere of mellow amiability and relaxed goodwill was not, I told myself, a true guide to what the Bullets were feeling or thinking. These waters were deceptively still. Their stagnation contained danger and disease. How was Sybil's cheerful acceptance of King to be reconciled with the loathing she had shown for him the day before? What common factor was there between Patricia's enthusiasm for her mother's photograph album and her wild sport with the great tawny beast? Once again, the lion insinuated himself into my mind. Was it imagination, or could I hear him growling to himself, far away in the darkness of the bush? It might have been only the faint and distant thunder of a tropical summer storm, or my own steadily mounting obsession. As I said, my nerves were very much on edge. Accordingly, when Bullet suddenly materialized beside me, I could appreciate and share Sybil's hatred for cat-footed people. I nearly cried out in fright as his huge shadow fell across the circle of lamp light. Bullet had changed back into his bush shirt, khaki slacks, and heavy boots. His hair was once more a shaggy, tangled mess. In one hand he carried the bottle of whiskey I had given him. It was still half full. "I know you've got a whole case of the stuff," he said, cutting short my protestations. "But I insist on our finishing this bottle together tonight. No point in keeping it. Too much gone already." Friendship radiated from his heavy features. "It's a very long time indeed since we've enjoyed such a happy evening at home," he went on. "Your presence has a calming effect on Sybil, and The child adores you." I hurried off in search of some glasses. Whenever I was alone with Bullet, I found myself wanting a drink badly. We sat and sipped our whiskey in silence. I sensed that my companion was finding this moment of relaxation as beneficial as I did. Yet now again, I thought, I heard a distant roar echo across the stillness of the night. Bullet didn't move a muscle. I must have been mistaken. Perhaps in his case, familiarity had bred indifference. "Why didn't King stay with you indefinitely?" I asked. "Because of Sybil. She wasn't born and brought up in East Africa. She got to a point where she couldn't bear to see his mane and claws around the place the whole time, and the way he had of leaping clear across the room at a single bound to lick her hand or jump up with his 4 paws on my shoulders. He was a big brute, you know, and every time Patricia romped in the grass with him, Sybil nearly passed out with sheer fright. She began to feel a creeping horror for King, and of course King knew it. He stopped coming up to caress her, and wouldn't let her stroke him. At that point she became so terrified that she swore she'd leave me and go back to Nairobi if I didn't get rid of King. Well, I wouldn't have minded losing King, but there was Pat to consider. Bullet broke off at this point, and I saw by his expression that he was finding it very hard to go on. But I had become caught up in this story, like a wild creature in a snare, and at all cost I had to know how it ended. Bullet, I knew instinctively, would refuse me nothing tonight. Well, I demanded insistently, what happened then? We both did what we had to do, Sybil and I, Bullet said. That same morning I took King by the Land Rover to the farthest boundary of the reserve and abandoned him there. And Sybil drove Pat into Nairobi and left her in the best girls' school in town. Bullet sighed deeply. I suppose you know we had to let Pat come home again very soon after that. Yes, I had heard. Well, Bullet said, tapping his glass lightly on the table top for emphasis. The day after she was back, King turned up outside the bungalow, and they were off playing games together in the clearing. Bullet was silent for some time. Then he went on. Sybil begged me to shoot the lion. You've got to understand how she felt. But how could I do it? Even today, Pat has scarcely forgiven me for the beasts I slaughtered long before she was born. Bullet looked up at me heavily and said, If I had had King's blood on my hands, can you imagine what she would have thought? The former great white hunter shut his eyes and shivered. In that case, I persisted. Bullet shrugged his shoulders. We reached a compromise solution, he said. Pat and I found the tree you visited this morning with her. Next day, when King came back to the bungalow, we all 3 went off there. Pat explained to King that this was where their meetings would take place in future. She really made him understand. Think, like a, well, you see what I'm getting at. She can do anything with him. You know that now yourself. don't you?" "Indeed I do," I said. "The lion was fond of me as well," Bullet said. "When I was on my way home from a tour of inspection, he'd get wind of my car from miles away and come running to meet me. It still happens today sometimes. I suddenly see him charging toward me in some God-forsaken part of the bush, just to give me a warm welcome. But his relationship with the child is something different again. He knew her scent and touch from the moment he was conscious of anything at all. He belongs to her forever." Bullet poured the last of the whiskey into his glass, drained it, and got up. "One thing more," I said. "Has King got a mate and cubs of his own?" Bullet's eyes were covered with a fine network of red veins. He said, as though he had not heard my question, "I drink too much, you know. Good night, and sleep well." He walked heavily, yet noiselessly, down the veranda steps. I did not linger on the veranda, but went straight to my room. As I opened the door, I saw the little monkey, Nicholas, sitting beside my pillow, and stretched out on my bed, in pink cotton pajamas, was Patricia. My astonishment set her off into one of her really childish bursts of laughter. She jumped up off the bed, the top of her flimsy pajama jacket half open. Beneath the sunburned neck, her skin was pathetically delicate and pale. She said, "I got out by the window and climbed in here the same way. I had to. I've given my parents quite enough worry today already." I found myself wondering whether Kahoro kept an eye on Patricia at night as well as during the daytime. "That's why I'm only going to stay a minute," she went on. "I just came to tell you to get up very early tomorrow morning. We'll go and see the Maasai organize their manyatta, their camp, that is. It's very curious. You wait and see." The Maasai, the flamboyant, exotic headdress of Urunga, the moraine, seemed to flicker before my eyes. "All right then. At dawn tomorrow?" Patricia asked. "At dawn tomorrow," I said. Small monkey and small girl vanished through the window simultaneously. Chapter 5. It was in the barest part of the reserve that Urunga and the ancient Okalu had sought out a camping site for their clan. The Maasai are children of the great dry plains. They distrust heavily overgrown terrain. Tree cults, or the spirit of the forest, are alien to their instinctive temperament. The spot finally chosen by Urunga and Okalu, therefore, was near a water hole, and on a slight rise overlooking a wide expanse of bare, parched savanna. There was no track leading to the camp, but the ground was clear enough for a car to approach it without trouble. The going was so easy, indeed, that by sunrise we were already in sight of the bare hillside, all dotted with black figures. "There they are," Patricia exclaimed, leaning out of the window. "And we're here in time." She slid back onto the seat beside me. "Look at our two blacks," she said, laughing. "They don't feel at all happy. Do you know why?" Well, Bogo's scared. Of course he's scared, said Patricia contemptuously. He's a town-bred Kikuyu. What about Kahoro? Oh, he's not scared by the Maasai. He just hates them. He'd like to kill them all. Her voice took on the faintly superior tone that always crept into it when she was enlightening my ignorance. Kahoro belongs to the Wakamba, she told me, and the Wakamba are very brave people. Besides, they've always been fighting the Maasai. Even today, despite all the government's laws against such things, they still have occasional pitched battles, to the death. They occupy adjacent territory, you see. Patricia leaned forward to the front seat, where the old one-eyed tracker sat, and whispered a few words to him in his native dialect. Kahoro bared his withered gums in a ferocious grin and patted his rifle. You're deliberately rousing him, I told the child. Why? To make him really dangerously angry, she said. When he goes too far, I calm him down and get him under control again. It's a game I play. I said, but he doesn't know it's a game. Of course he doesn't. There wouldn't be any fun in it if he did. Kahoro, the one-eyed, I thought. The great Lion King. What strange new partners would the future allot Patricia for her private game? And in what unexplored territories would she play it? By now, we had reached the bottom of the little hills. Patricia jumped out of the car before it even stopped. The tropical sun was rising in all its glory, but the pure dawn air was heavy with a manurish stink that put me in mind of a badly neglected stable. Come on quick, Patricia called out to me. They're beginning. She dragged me along the low ridge before us till we reached the summit of the hill. Here there was a flat, open space, in the shape of a large oval. Round the outer edge of this space ran a double zareba of thorn bushes intersected by trenches. Inside the enclosure lay a thick, sticky, yellowish mess of half-liquid cow dung. Its odor was unbelievably disgusting. A crowd of natives, men, women, and children alike, were busy with this filthy stuff, pounding, kneading, trampling it, to give it some sort of consistency of texture. Patricia addressed them in their own tongue. At first, these fierce faces showed nothing but surprise at being thus addressed by a small white girl. Then even the most stony and cruel of them insensibly softened. The women uttered shrill yelps of laughter, and the children shrieked with delight. I looked round for Runga, but failed to see any of the three moraines. I spotted old Okalu, however, and greeted him. He recognized me at once. Kwahiri, he called out, and then signaled to his people to go on with their work. The fetid stench became thicker and more powerful than ever. I recoiled instinctively, holding my breath. Patricia, however, seemed not in the least put out. This was the little girl who had left a delicate whiff of soap and lavender water behind her when she left my bungalow the night before. indeed, I could still smell it on her. This was the child whose sense of smell was so acute that she could pick out each individual scent of plant or beast in the bush. Yet now she was snuffing up this repugnant stink, her eyes shining with pleasure. She was like those upper-class children who are born and bred in the big house, but grow up around the farmyard with a crowd of village urchins, and get far more enjoyment out of filthy jobs like cleaning out cowsheds and stables than from occupations more suited to their station in life. You know, they're sly, these Maasai, Patricia said. She clearly wanted me to partake of her excited enthusiasm. Really intelligent, too. Fancy making houses out of cow pats. They never live anywhere for long, you see, and they haven't got shovels or tools of any kind, so they've invented this idea for themselves. They pen up their herd for a whole day and night on the spot where they want their camp. Then they knead the dung and get it ready for building. And after that, I asked. You'll see, Patricia said. Hold on, they're beginning now. Round the sticky mass, several men were now erecting hurdles. On top of these they fixed an arcing roof of branches, which acquired some cohesion from the thorns and spines that covered them. The hurdles were arranged in an oval pattern that matched the shape of the little hilltop plateau. In a very short space of time, they had built a kind of large, open-work hut that ran the whole length of the open ground. It was very low, not standing higher than the chest of its builders, and bristling with thorns. Now then, Patricia cried, watch what happens next. Old Okalu gave an order, and at once all of them, men, women, and children alike, set to work digging up the soft, steaming muck they had just been preparing, and began to spread it over the framework of branches. Some of them used their hands, others the goatskin bottles that normally held milk or drinking water. The stinking, half-liquid brownish paste was slapped on the hurdles, where it ran down dripping to the ground, and finally solidified into a wall. By the same process, the arcing thorn branches were turned into a roof. As quickly as possible, this first layer was reinforced by a second, as the community showered their new home with fresh daubs of cow dung. In a few hours the sun will dry it all out, as hard as a bone, Patricia said. Wonderful, isn't it? Although it was still early in the morning, thick, droning swarms of horseflies had already settled on the wet muck. Let's go now, I called out to Patricia. There's nothing more to see, is there? Two little Maasai girls were cracking jokes at her and exploding in gales of giggles. Just a minute, Patricia said. I'm having such fun. Then she ran back to me, shouting, Do listen, it's a smashing joke. These girls thought we were married. Who? You and me, of course, Patricia said. She paused to savor my astonishment. Then she explained. These kids aren't any older than me, and plenty of them are married already. That's the custom among the Maasai. The rest wait till the young men of the clan have finished their time as moraines. Where are the moraines, by the way? Over here, Patricia said. She led me across to the opposite side of the plateau from that by which we had come. At the foot of the slope, and nicely camouflaged by it, I saw the Maasai herd, penned in a square corral constructed from thorn bushes. Among the cattle I could see the rays of the rising sun flash back from 3 spears and 3 coppery heads of dressed hair. "We'll go down," Patricia said. The moraines had just got the cattle jammed up against a big, movable hurdle made of prickly branches, which formed the entrance to the corral. Patricia stood watching the young men, motionless. For their part, they did not deign to pay us the slightest attention. In Patricia's eyes, I saw that solemn, remote expression which had been there on the first morning I met her, when she was watching the wild animals. "In the old days," Patricia said, in a low, husky voice, "before a moraine could call himself a man, or have the right to a wife, he had to kill a lion, not from long range, with a powerful gun either, with his spear and machete. By now, the cattle were lined up ready to move out of the corral, yet the young warriors made no move to lift away the big hurdle blocking the entrance. Then each of them went up to a cow and made a tiny incision in its neck with the sharp-filled point of his spear. Each put his mouth to the fresh wound and sucked the blood out in great gulps. Then they held one hand over the nick they had made and waited till it clotted. The cows had not so much as mooed. That is all the nourishment they get, Patricia said. Milk in the evening, blood in the morning. The thorny hurdle was now removed, and the herd streamed out to graze, with Arunga leading them. As he passed close by us, his tongue came out and licked a streak of red off his dark cheek. His eyes, burning and contemptuous, glanced for a moment over Patricia. Then he moved on, proud as a demigod, though his only food was blood and milk, his only shelter the dung cast by his scrawny cows. Chapter 6. Patricia was silent and thoughtful. I asked her whether we might go back to the car. "If you like," she said. We completed our circuit of the hilltop. By now, the Manyata on its narrow plateau was complete. If I had not actually seen it under construction, it is just possible I should not have noticed it. The thorny zareba blended into the natural clumps of thorn bushes dotted about the little hill. The Manyata itself stood scarcely higher than the prickly hedge protecting it, and was already sun-baked to the color of parched earth. It resembled a kind of giant curling caterpillar, and its brownish texture made it easily mistakable for a fold or ridge of earth in the bush. It was then that I recollected having seen walls similar to these, on more than one occasion, crumbling away at the top of the little knolls scattered about the savannah. I had never guessed how they came to be there. Now that the stench had evaporated, and clouds of flies were not buzzing angrily round my head, I could better appreciate the admiration which Patricia had expressed for this wattle and dung creation. It was a striking testament to the ingenuity of poverty, and the best possible defense the Masai could have against the only enemies they feared on this earth, the burden of stability, the putting down of roots, attachment to any one permanent home. There could have been no finer dwelling place for these eternal nomads than the manyatta. It was the makeshift house, par excellence, a temporary refuge that was easy to build, no trouble to abandon, and liable to crumble away soon after it was vacated. Kahoro stood with his fractured pelvis propped against the side of the car, his rifle unslung, staring at the manyatta out of his one sound eye. Patricia said not a word to him. She hardly seemed to notice his existence. When we had all taken our places in the car once more, it was Patricia, not me, that Bogo turned for instructions. But Patricia either failed to observe this, or refused to let on that she had done so. So Bogo decided to drive back along the route by which we had come. Patricia lay back with her eyes shut. She seemed to be asleep, but I knew her too well by now to be taken in by this pose. While feigning apathy, she was, in point of fact, thinking hard. A short distance in front of us, a moving cloud of dust showed where the Masai herd was still on the march. When we caught up with them, Bogo gave them a very wide berth in passing. On either flank of the herd, high above the swirling dust, gleamed the exotic top knot of a moraine. In the van, haloed with clouds of dusty glory, advanced the helmet of plaited hair which belonged to Urunga. Patricia half opened her eyes. I thought she was reflecting on the most handsome and savage of the three young warriors as a man, but not a bit of it. Her mind was preoccupied with the thought of the blood he had recently drunk. She said, "When I began to feed King on raw meat, he used to wolf it down so noisily and with such enjoyment that I tried it too, but it wasn't very nice. Later on, Kahoro used to go outside the reserve with his gun and kill game for King to eat. Later still, King went hunting on his own account. To begin with, he would bring gazelle or antelope back to the house. He carried them in his mouth, you know, but Mummy didn't like that. That was when my father had to punish King a lot, and when he tore the koboko to bits after being beaten with it." As she thought of this incident, Patricia giggled slightly, but almost at once her face fell back into those serious, almost harsh lines which aged her in so striking a fashion. "The happiest moments of King's life," Patricia remarked, "were when he was licking the blood off his chops, or so I thought. Anyway, I tried that too once or twice. I soaked my finger in blood and licked it clean. It tasted horrid." Patricia turned and looked out of the back of the car, but the herd and its leader had passed out of sight. Even the dust cloud had dwindled to a barely discernible pencil mark on the sky. "I haven't wanted to taste blood for ages now," Patricia said. "But when that Moraine started licking the blood off his lips just now, you saw him, didn't you? It made me think of King. Just for a second or so, I felt the urge again. Silly, really." She shook her head, and the neat fringe bobbed up and down. "The Maasai," she said, "drink cow's blood almost from the minute they're weaned. They acquire the habit just like those animals that kill in order to eat." By now, we had left the open grazing land, where the Maasai had set up their manyatta, and were driving across country, following the easiest route for the car. We bumped through ravines, between high rocky cliffs, jolted across clearings in the jungle, and skirted round the lower slopes of thickly wooded hills. Wildlife was everywhere, in abundance. It seemed to multiply before our very eyes. Patricia sat with her chin resting on the edge of the car door. The window was wound down and watched. It was astonishing how thickly the area teemed with animals, even allowing for it being a protected sanctuary. "This is the time when they're all coming back from the water holes," Patricia said. "The females want to graze and get some exercise." Her delicate nostrils and soft, childish mouth quivered. "And the males," she added, "are going hunting." She gripped Bogo by the shoulder. "Drive as slowly as possible," she told him. Then she said to me, "If a car is cruising gently along and not making much noise, the animals take no notice of it. They think it's some sort of animal itself." "Do you understand, Bogo?" I asked the driver. "Yes, sir, I understands." From where I sat, I could just see one side of his face. The crumpled folds and wrinkles of skin uncreased a little as he spoke. This was the nearest Bogo ever got to a smile. "Stop talking now," Patricia whispered, craning out of the window. She scanned the bush with concentrated attention. We drove for a while across a bare, open plain, where herd after herd of zebra galloped away at our approach. Then the car began to follow a kind of natural track that wound away round the bottom of a slight slope, heavily overgrown with scrub. Patricia whispered to Bogo to stop. Then, very slowly and gently, she opened the car door, made a sign to me to stay where I was, and slipped out. With an almost imperceptible twist of his body, Kahoro shifted round so that his double-barreled gun covered her progress. Without a sound, she moved forward in the direction of two big, tangled clumps of bushes, with a narrow track running between them. Suddenly she froze. Kahoro's gun lifted a fraction from his knees. A great cat's head had materialized out of the bushes, an exquisitely shaped head, drawn in delicate, fluid lines, its light skin all dappled with tawny patches. But the open jaws revealed a terrible set of fangs, and a murderous growl rumbled deep in the beast's throat. It moved into the open a little. Its muzzle and throat were slender, and it had long, narrow paws. Its neck was more rounded than a leopard's or a panther's, and its spots smaller and not so dark. It was in fact a full-grown cheetah. Patricia stood her ground, as motionless as if she had been a small wooden image left standing out in the bush, and stared it straight in the eyes. After a moment that seemed to me like an eternity, the great cat took a step back, and the little girl a step forward. Then they both froze once more. Finally, the cheetah retreated a little farther, and Patricia advanced accordingly. They both disappeared into the bushes. Kehoro was responsible for Patricia's safety. I wondered if he would follow her, but no, he left his gun lying across his knees and closed his one good eye. Clearly he knew just when Patricia's mysterious powers protected her more surely than any bullet could do. Patricia had left the car door ajar. I pushed it wide open, got out myself, and by standing on tiptoe, managed to see over the top of the bushes. There was a carcass lying there. In shape and size, it resembled a very young foal. It had a white skin lined with black stripes. Two cats with cream-colored bodies, dusted all over with what looked like brown confetti, were playing nearby. They were the most magnificent and graceful creatures imaginable. They moved like quicksilver, chasing each other round, butting, flicking out with their paws, somersaulting over and over. Occasionally, the cheetah cubs stopped playing to gnaw a quick mouthful from the carcass of the little zebra. Patricia and the big cheetah were out of sight in the bushes. What was passing between them? How and what could they communicate to each other? When at last Patricia returned, I said, "Why don't you keep a couple of those creatures as pets? I'm told they can be made wonderfully tame." The child stared at me in astonishment and disdain. "Cheetahs, after King." She paused, and then repeated King's name, more gently this time. A fierce, almost savage determination hardened her features. I could not guess what it meant, but it frightened me. "Let's go back," I said. "You got me out of bed before daybreak. Besides, after all those flies and the cow dung, I feel I need a bath." "You can go back if you like," Patricia said, "but I'm staying." I had no alternative but to stay with her. She bent down now and whispered something in Kehoro's ear. The old, scarred tracker shook his head firmly. It was the first time I had ever seen him refuse her anything. Patricia insisted. Her speech grew faster, more emphatic. Finally, Kehoro bowed his head in acquiescence. If she had dealt with him as she had dealt with me, what could he do but give in? And what could Bogo do but follow the directions and signs by which the old man indicated the new route we were to follow, the route laid down by Patricia? I am pretty sure that very few men, either white or black, had ever ventured where Kehoro now took us. Our only predecessor was Bullet, who had taken his Land Rover into the farthest recesses of this vast, wild territory, where the beast held undisputed sovereignty. We passed through deep glens and thickets, which gave way in turn to dry, crackling scrub. Rolling savanna shimmered away toward mysterious forest on the horizon. From time to time, we caught a glimpse of the summit of Kilimanjaro. Heavy, thorny branches whipped and scraped against the sides of the car. But all the time, we were continually reminded of the presence of wildlife, of animals at ease in their natural habitat. Eyes, ears, and nose alike bore witness to their activities. We saw them scattering away from us at a gallop or in quick, graceful bounds, according to species. The air was full of their calls. They neighed, howled, roared, and trumpeted all around us. For every beast, small or large, timid or predatory, it was now feeding time. Kahoro signaled to Bogo to stop. We pulled up between two thick clumps of tangled trees and bushes which concealed us completely. Kahoro, Patricia, and I all got out of the car. Bogo was sweating with fright. Even the drops of perspiration that ran down his face looked gray. I felt very sorry for him and said, lingering a little behind the others, "There's nothing to be afraid of. Remember what the little white girl said." "I will try, sir," said Bogo humbly. Patricia and Kahoro had only a few seconds' start on me, but they moved from cover to cover so nimbly and with such silent speed that neither sound nor shadow showed which way they had gone. They were quite close at hand, and yet as remote and inaccessible as if they had been miles off. How on earth was I to find them in this thorny labyrinth? Luckily for me, Patricia, irritated no doubt by the noise I made as I crashed through the tangled undergrowth, gave a low whistle to let me know where she was. I found her crouching in the lee of a big thorn bush. She was alone. "Where's Kahoro?" I whispered. Patricia pointed through the interlacing branches. I looked and saw a long, gently sloping grassy expanse, dotted with clumps of trees. "What's he doing there?" In that flat, toneless whisper of hers, Patricia said, "He knows exactly where all the beasts have their hunting grounds, so you see." She broke off abruptly as a long, drawn-out call rose on the still air, an extraordinary sound, somewhere between an animal howl and a savage's war cry. It seemed to go on forever. I made a movement to stand up and look, but Patricia held me back. The call stopped, started again, was cut off short. Then the long note swelled out once more. "Look through here," Patricia whispered. I bent down and peered between two branches. Their thorns scratched my hands and face. It did not matter. I saw Kahoro, saw him clearly, leaning against a lonely acacia tree in the middle of the open ground before me. Saw, too, the great lion bounding toward him, mane flying in the wind. It was King. When he reached the tree, King reared up on his hind legs and placed his forepaws on the shoulders of the man who called to him. Kahoro found King when he was a tiny, abandoned cub, Patricia said. Kahoro saved his life. King has never forgotten that. Kahoro hugged the lion's great head against his own old scarred face. Then he took King by the mane and led him toward the thicket where we lay concealed. King sniffed at me and recognized my scent. Then, without making a sound, he greeted Patricia. She said, "It's the time of day when he goes hunting." I did not ask for any explanations. Everything now seemed not only possible, but natural, a matter of course. I had crossed the great dividing frontier and stepped into the world of Patricia and Kahoro and King. The old tracker now left us. Patricia kept King close by her side, one hand gripping his mane, and I sensed, by some unanalyzable instinct, just what was about to happen. Kahoro had formerly been one of the best beaters in East Africa. Now he was going to demonstrate his ancient skill once more, but not this time for the benefit of a white hunter, or indeed of any human being. We waited a long time, but when the climax came, it was all over in a flash. A shrill, elating cry rang out, quickly followed by another and yet another. They seemed to come from all quarters of the compass simultaneously, and to fill the whole sky with their sharp clamor. A troop of buffalo, which had been grazing at the far end of the plain, scattered in terror. Behind one of them Kahoro appeared, driving it toward our hiding place, with more of those wild, unnerving yells of his. The buffalo skirted the edge of the thicket, grunting heavily, its nostrils scummy with foam, hooves thudding on the ground. Then Patricia let go of King's mane, and uttered that soft, whistling hiss that I remembered so vividly, and which indeed had all but set the huge lion onto me. King sprang clear of the bushes at a single bound, and then I saw, in real life, the picture I had first encountered in one of my reading primers, and which had haunted my whole childhood. A buffalo tearing along at a frenzied gallop, with a lion straddling its back, and the lion's claws raking deep into those great humped shoulders. After this fabulous pair of beasts had vanished among the bushes in a great cloud of dust, and Kahoro had rejoined us, Patricia still stood staring at the spot where the buffalo had disappeared, with King clinging fiercely to its back. There was no specific physical resemblance between Patricia's face and that of her father, but how she reminded me of him at this moment. To put it more exactly, what I saw now on her smooth, childish face was the same tortured, passionate expression Bullet had displayed while recalling the old days, when he had killed without mercy or respite. Suddenly, Patricia put one ear to the ground and listened for a moment. "All over now," she said, and straightened up again. In my mind's eye, I could see the buffalo stumble and collapse, fainting from loss of blood. "You're so fond of animals," I said to her. "What about that buffalo? Don't you feel any compassion for him?" The child stared at me in some astonishment and said, "But lions have to eat to live, don't they?" I thought of the cheetah's cubs, tearing at the carcass of the baby zebra. "That's true," I said, "and King must have a family too." Instantaneously, Patricia went white and rigid. Her mouth quivered pitiably. I thought she was going to cry, but she got herself under control again. Her expression, when she met my eyes once more, was quite inscrutable. "Very likely," she said. We walked back to the car in silence. Chapter 7. I had a scalding hot bath when I got home, and stewed in it for so long that Bullet found me lying there, half asleep. "Aha!" he exclaimed. "All the perfumes of the manyatta, I presume." His childish ogre's laugh boomed out, filling the whole bungalow. Then he said, "When you move on to interior disinfection, I don't mind joining you." We were still on our first whiskey when angry voices made themselves heard in the scrub, quite close by. Bullet cocked an ear. "Wakamba, I fancy," he said. A dozen natives, clad in ragged cotton garments, barefooted, and armed with spears and machetes, emerged from cover and approached the veranda steps, escorted by several rangers. Bullet walked over to the top of the steps himself, and the Wakamba shouted and waved their weapons. "Complete savages," Bullet said to me, grinning. "They don't even speak Swahili, and that's the only native lingo I know. I'll have to get hold of Kahoro. He belongs to their tribe." At this moment, Kahoro appeared in front of the bungalow, as though by magic, and began to harangue Bullet with such vehemence that the blood rushed to his blind eye, flecking it an angry red. "Never any peace and quiet in this damned reserve," Bullet grumbled. "Now they're accusing the Maasai of lifting their cattle. Kahoro backs them up. I'll have to go over there right away. If I don't, they'll go on their own, and in that case—" Bullet raised his arms above his head in mock despair. They nearly touched the veranda roof, and let them drop to his sides again. Then he emptied his glass and said, "Like to come with me? It won't be a long job." 6 of us piled into the Land Rover. The most venerable Wakamba elder and 2 rangers got in the back, and I squeezed in front between Bullet and Kahoro. Only the rangers carried guns. Bullet had forbidden Kahoro to take his. He'd slaughter all the Maasai and enjoy it, the big, jolly, red-headed warden said, and roared with laughter. Bullet drove very fast and skillfully, going straight for his objective without any detours. His Land Rover, with its 4-wheel transmission and specially strengthened chassis, could overcome hazards entirely beyond the powers of my own car. We came in sight of the manyatta long before I imagined it possible. "Nice quick trip, like I told you," Bullet said, jumping out. "It won't take any time to settle this business either. I will say this for the Maasai. They're the only natives I know of out here who are too proud to tell a lie, whatever the truth may cost them." The tropical sun had already done its work on that strange construction that crowned the little hilltop. Both walls and roof had dried out. Even the stink had become more or less bearable. It was as though it had been sucked up and dispersed by the heat. The Manyata now resembled a circular tunnel, divided up by party walls into a series of identical cells. Each cell had a single exit, flush with its wall. It was in one of these that Bullet found old Okalu, stretched out on the floor. The efforts he had put into pounding cow dung and spreading it over the walls of the Manyata had reopened one of a score of old wounds that some lion had inflicted on him nearly half a century before. But as soon as he saw the warden of the national park, the ancient Maasai chief tottered to his feet, drawing a blood-stained cloth wrap more closely about his belly. The action was not prompted by any subservience to Bullet, but by his own sense of dignity and self-respect. The curving roof was so close to the ground that even a man of average height could not stand upright in the cell. Okalu and Bullet were both extremely tall. They were forced to begin their discussion, which they conducted in Swahili, bent practically double. After a few sentences, they gave up and went outside. I remained alone in the cell during this interlude, meditating on the quintessential bareness of the Manyata considered as a human habitation. Nowhere else could one find a similar structure so utterly denuded of all those conveniences with which man normally surrounds himself. It contained nothing at all, neither the most primitive hearth nor any kind of furnishing, such as a food bag or a rush mat, not even a cooking pot or eating bowl. Nothing. Outside, the Maasai were crowding round Bullet and Okalu in the central area formed by the walls of the Manyata, and applauding their old chief's remarks. Okalu leaned heavily on his spear as he talked. Bullet said to me, "He's coming out with us to the grazing land. He admits that the moraines did lift some of the Wakamba cattle when crossing their territory before they entered the reserve. That is, but he's not concerned with how many or which particular beasts. That's the business of the moraines themselves, according to him." We drove out quickly in Bullet's Land Rover to the grazing grounds, where he found a miserable, half-starved herd cropping away at the parched grass and thorn bushes. Orunga and his two companions were squatting on their haunches in the shade of a leafy dwarf acacia, keeping an eye on the cattle. Their spears were planted in the ground, within easy reach. None of them got up as we approached. Not one of those heads of clay-daubed hair so much as looked round when the Wakamba leader, shrill with fury, pointed out two cows browsing a little way off. Okalu asked Orunga a question, and the moraine shook his head nonchalantly. "My God," exclaimed Bullet, his heavy face turning purple with rage. "My God, the impudent bastard's telling us he didn't steal those two cows. Christ, it's the first time I ever struck a Maasai who was a liar." But Orunga, his lips curling with superior contempt, now uttered a few indolent words, which Alkalu duly translated for Bullet's benefit. Bullet, hardly aware of what he did, gave a faint whistle. Then he said, and there was a queer streak of respect in his voice which offset the angry tone of his words, "The impotent bastard. He says it's not true that they took 2 cows. The fact of the matter is that they lifted 3. The 3rd cow stolen from the Wakamba had been grazing out of sight behind a bush. Now it came out and joined the 2 others. After much shouting and threats and sarcastic insults and triumphant jeers at the expense of the Maasai, Kehoro and his fellow tribesmen led off the 3 head of cattle. The rangers brought up the rear to protect them. Orunga still squatted there on his haunches, his eyes half closed, and his face set in an expression of utter indifference. But as the 2 Wakamba, with their cattle and escort, were about to leave the grazing ground for the bush, the moraine suddenly straightened up, plucked his spear from the ground, and threw it. The uncoiling of his splendid body had been so swift, and each movement so beautifully coordinated, that the double-pointed metal shaft seemed to spring from the ground by itself, leap into Orunga's hand, and be launched of its own volition. It hissed, quivering, through the air, and struck the cow that Kehoro was leading fair and square in the neck. The cow gave one convulsive shudder and fell dead. Orunga's 2 companions now seized their own spears, but by now it was too late. The rangers had them covered with their rifles, and Olkalu, his bloody bandage wrapped round his belly, placed himself between the young warriors and their target. The old Maasai chief spoke to Bullet, who nodded in agreement. "We might as well go now," Bullet told me. "The old chap swears that if the district commissioner awards an indemnity to the Wakamba, the Maasai will be glad to pay it. He reckons it isn't a high price for saving a moraine's self-respect." Orunga sank back on his haunches, smiling to himself. For some unknown reason, I found myself thinking of Patricia, and I couldn't explain this either. I decided I was glad that she had not been here to see his moment of triumph. But that same evening, when Bullet and Sybil came round on my invitation for the usual evening drink, Patricia came with them. She waited till her father and mother were standing on the veranda steps, watching the last rays of the sun sinking behind Kilimanjaro, and then, in her toneless, secret voice, but her eyes were bright with mischief, she said, "That Maasai, who's such a handy shot with a spear, isn't he the Moraine who stared at me this morning